Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, he tried retail campaigning, wholesale campaigning, town halls, virtual town halls, YouTube videos, appeals for a return to the salad days of Obama and his own glory days in the Senate, promising the party base that he really is a progressive. Nothing worked. But after stepping to the side and looking on, as competing candidates were shown the door at just the right moment by party elites, thus essentially being handed the nomination, Joe Biden has a problem. It's called exposure. With the COVID crisis consuming our lives, people are simply not paying attention to presidential politics or much of anything else for that matter. So now, Joe Biden's latest shot in the dark is a podcast. Here's the Deal, debuted this week, produced by the Biden campaign as the presumptive and quarantined nominee, desperately attempts to gain a measure of visibility during a time when his opponents on national TV speaking on matters of great importance at the dinner hour almost every day.
I think this podcast could offer some really helpful information. I've seen these kinds of crises before, and I've sat in the Situation Room in the Oval Office, and we've grappled with crises from Ebola outbreak to the Iran nuclear deal to the auto industry rescue. And during that time, I've been able to work with some pretty accomplished experts, women and men who have steered us through epidemics, pandemics, some of the most complex problems that this country could possibly face, and people who provide some advice and logic and information on the coronavirus crisis that we're facing. So each week what I'm going to try to do is be joined by one of those experts, someone who can offer us some helpful information. Then the two of us will answer questions from you. And our first episode, I'm going to be joined by Ron Klain.
By now, most everyone, including Biden's campaign managers, of course, understand that he must be put in a controlled environment whenever possible. And to say this podcast was tightly controlled and edited would be an understatement, to the point where it amounts to little more than a campaign commercial. And to paraphrase that line Lloyd Benson pulled on Dan Quayle, having been on the Liberty Nation podcast, The Uprising, for years, Mr. Biden, I know podcasts, and that's no podcast. Now, having edited audio for many more years than I care to remember, an informal personal account on Here's the Deal would put the count at about 50 edits, many of them abrupt. Now, I want you to listen carefully to this 29-second clip with 7 or 8 edits, some of them really clunky.
Ron is an outside advisor to my campaign. He led the Ebola response in President Obama's and my administration in 2014. And so he's going to talk to us about a few things. First, about how President Trump downplays this crisis, how he has rattled public confidence and delayed our country's response. Next, we'll talk a bit about my plan with the federal government, what they should be doing now. When I say now, I mean immediately to combat this crisis. And finally, take on some questions from our listeners.
Now, we'll get to the content in there, but why do I focus on the edits? Because the guy is running for president and he can't get through a scripted, simple, informal, 30-second happy talk, scripted opening to his podcast without 7 or 8 takes. What does that say about his ability to withstand the cauldron of a presidential race against Donald Trump? And here's the other point. Some of the edits, as you heard, were so poorly executed, which reveals, again, the baffling technological incompetence of the Biden campaign, which may well reveal more far-reaching incompetence, and the difficulty in trying to package a candidate who must be held on such a short leash. But at least in this case, because the podcast was recorded and heavily edited, it did not feature the type of live stream meltdowns that have recently characterized the Biden campaign. Now, I love when Biden said in that last clip that he'll take some questions from his listeners, take some questions from our listeners in his first podcast, meaning there haven't been any listeners. Wow. So as the former vice president transmits from his home, stuck there like a teenager in his parents' basement, by promising to speak with experts on the coronavirus, and then brings on Ron Klain, as you heard, a political hack, his longtime chief of staff, never identified as such, by the way, to obediently call him Mr. Vice President over and over, while asking and answering planned questions from demographically correct young voters, the kind who flocked to Bernie Sanders while avoiding Biden like the plague before the whole nominating process was frozen. So Biden asked questions of his political advisor as if the guy's some kind of expert on coronavirus, the kind that he promised to produce in the opening of the podcast, and as if the question and answer had not been scripted in advance.
Is there a shortage of testing, and why does that exist if there is?
Well, this is one of the biggest problems we've seen with the coronavirus response. As you've said, Mr. Vice President, the coronavirus isn't Donald Trump's fault, but how we responded to it is, and there's no issue that illustrates that more than this testing fiasco. Donald Trump didn't take the steps needed to get the testing in place. As a result, compared to almost every other developed nation, we're behind on getting people tested. That problem falls squarely on the shoulders of President Trump and his administration.
Again, I just love how he repeatedly calls him Mr. Vice President. That's very funny. Biden says more than once he won't make the podcast political, and then repeatedly engages in naked political attacks. He calls for people to come together at this time, saying, quote, "I'm so proud we are working together," while ripping President Trump's handling of the crisis. He says in one breath that Trump has rattled the public's confidence, and in the next says the president has lied about the crisis, never specifying exactly how. Don't you love how Klain repeats Biden's deeply reassuring statement that the deadly virus is not Trump's fault? Whew, that's a relief, but of course the response to it is. However, it can be said in all this that the former vice president's hindsight in a time of crisis is 20/20. We could aptly employ the expression Monday morning quarterback if we ever again remember what that once meant. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee also spoke of his predictably government-centric alternative plan for handling the crisis, touting his own panel of one-time experts. More federal spending, more regulations, more reliance on global institutions like the World Health Organization, less on private industry, all the time creating a transparently political veil to drape over this crisis. Folks, let's be clear about why Joe Biden finally hit a hot streak. It was by doing nothing. Indeed, as the threat of Bernie Sanders actually becoming the nominee grew menacing after the socialist senator won the first three presidential nomination contests, the former vice president simply stood aside and watched as his party's elites quickly ran every other non-Bernie candidate out of the race, leaving Biden alone as the last man standing. Thus, they put a virtual gun to the head of Democratic voters, essentially forcing them to choose someone who was roundly written off, and for understandable, if not good reasons, because, well, this is the guy who the elites have selected to carry their water. Folks, this is the same Joe Biden who months ago was marked as a man in noticeable decline and was written off largely because of it. He has not suddenly stopped declining. He did not suddenly find a message. He did not suddenly find his footing. He did absolutely nothing to stir his own rise from the political dead. And the Here's the Deal podcast, the Biden campaign's latest shot in the dark, will likely do little or nothing to enhance the image of a man who voters will be learning an awful lot about in the months ahead. And we'll be back with Talkin' Liberty.